What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. Appreciate you joining me today. We did have some pretty big news on Saturday, and that is that both Jaire Alexander and Preston Smith restructured their contracts, opening up a plethora of salary cap space. Couple things here. It doesn't really change anything too much in the idea that now all of a sudden Green Bay has a bunch of salary cap space. These were always moves that were expected in some capacity. And I know I've seen a couple tweets out there of like, oh my goodness, Russ Ball, he does it again. He opened up a ton of salary cap space just by restructuring Preston Smith and Jaire Alexander. If you've been following along with us, both on a couple of my blueprints for the offseason as well as the salary cap 101, this is not a complex idea. This is not something that was out of the ordinary. This was not something that was unexpected. These were simple void year restructures, as basically opening up as much salary cap as possible using both Jaire Alexander and Preston Smith. Jaire Alexander's was 1,000,000% expected. They maybe could have done it without void years or so, without these max void years and stuff like that, but this was always going to happen in some capacity. The only question really that was answered with these moves was, would Preston Smith ultimately still be back with the team? And it was always like 95% likely that he would, maybe even more than that. If you remember in one of my offseason blueprints, in the complete rip the Band-Aid, basically meaning we're going to go full skeleton team, have Jordan Love be quarterback. We're going to rip all the veterans away from this team and kind of, basically do a full rebuild. There was one scenario there where I, even at that point said maybe in that situation, Preston Smith could be a release candidate based on where he was at and where the edge rushers are at in Green Bay. This was the expected outcome. No question about it. So Preston restructures, Jaire restructures, Green Bay opens salary cap space. The next question that I know a lot of people have is, that means Aaron's coming back. It has no bearing on that whatsoever. Meaning if Green Bay wanted to go forward with Jordan Love, they needed to open this salary cap space anyway. In fact, Green Bay needs more salary cap space if they trade away Aaron Rodgers. They need more salary cap space because he's going to take away a larger chunk of salary if they trade him pre-June 1st. So if you're saying like, oh my goodness, they're clearing up space so they can go all in with Aaron Rodgers, it's just not telling us that at this point. They could be clearing space so that they can go all in with Aaron Rodgers. That's within the realm of possibility. They could also be clearing space so that they can trade Aaron Rodgers. That is also a possibility. So these moves were going to be made almost no matter what. Like I said, the one thing we didn't know 100% for sure is if Preston would be back. But again, it was like 95 to 98% likely that he would be. And nothing about this, again, is that complex, is that complicated, is that unexpected. These were always set to happen. So big news in the fact that it did get done and Green Bay did clear a bunch of salary cap space. This does not open them up to all of a sudden go out and now be able to participate in free agency in a major way. They still have additional restructures that they will need to do as we've blueprinted so far this offseason. David Bakhtiari, Kenny Clark going to be probably the low-hanging fruit in some capacity. Kenny Clark will have to do some sort of restructure, and David Bakhtiari more likely than not to restructure, sort of a Preston Smith scenario. The vast majority of the likelihood at this point is that he does some sort of restructure. They could look to trade. They could look to release. Those are possibilities as well. But in the more likely scenario is that he restructures as well in some capacity. So that's where we're at. And I think the big news here is that, again, Preston Smith is back. There's going to still be free agents, restructures that need to get done to open up additional space, no matter what Green Bay does. And this is not a tell on whether or not Aaron Rodgers or Jordan Love will be back. I don't think there's anything that you can glean as to the future of the quarterback position based on these moves whatsoever. So nice to see that they were able to get this done. And in some capacity, I think nice to see Preston Smith back. Listen, however you think of this team right now and however you think of like their window to, compete for a Super Bowl and those sort of things, Preston Smith has been like the consummate professional in Green Bay. He has basically ingrained himself in the Packers culture. He's made himself a real piece of the Packers locker room and a significant piece of this Packers defense. So, however you feel about Preston on the field, which is the most important way to feel about an NFL player, is what he's ultimately bringing to your team and helping you win. I think he's a solid player, but he brings probably a little bit more than that to the locker room. And based on where Green Bay's at with edge rusher, you might be able to say like, hey, without Preston Smith, you've got Rashawn Gary, you've got JJ Enagbare. That's a really good place to start. And that sounds okay, but Enigbari still needs to put on legitimate functional strength, and there's no guarantee that he just comes in and is better in year two. In fact, if you've looked at recent Packer history, players in year two have not just all of a sudden been better. In fact, some, Josh Myers, have been worse in year two than they have been in year one. So there's no just guarantee that all of a sudden Enigbari takes a major step in year two. And of course, Rashawn Gary's coming back from a torn ACL. So having somebody like Preston Smith in your locker room on that defense, a veteran presence, and who has been extremely reliable for Green Bay does make a lot of sense. And oh, by the way, he has been much better in odd years. If you go back throughout the course of his career, for whatever reason, 2019, 2021 have been his best years as Green Bay Packer. And even going previous to that with the Commanders or, the Washington football team, etc. He's even better in odd years with those teams as well. So hopefully in 2023, we maybe see the best version yet of Preston Smith. Only time will certainly tell. All right, that brings us to our main topic for today. And I actually had this set up as my topic for today before Preston Smith segued so beautifully into this. And that is going to be basically looking at every single one of Brian Gutekunst free agent signings, I should say. So I already did the draft picks, every one of Brian Gutekunst's draft picks throughout his tenure as GM so far. And today I wanted to go through all of Brian Gutekunst's free agent signings. And I will tell you wholeheartedly, Dyer Carragher from Packer Report. I did see this pop up as something he recently did on Packer Report, which sparked my interest in having this topic. I have not read his article yet, but I can't recommend it enough just in general because Dyer does an amazing job over at Packer Report. So go to packerreport.com, check it out. I think he did. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. I just looked at the headline when he tweeted it out. And I'm like, oh, that'd be a really fun discussion to have. I think we did it a little bit differently. I think he just looked at Brian Gutekunst's high-priced free agent signings, and I'm looking at all of them. So I think there's a degree of difference. I probably should have read his article just to make sure I didn't miss anyone, I guess. But I'm excited to go out and check out his article as soon as I'm actually done recording this. One thing I will tell you just really quick, I don't read almost anything Packers related. There will be time to time where there's a new report on something, like if Demovsky is reporting something on the latest on Aaron Rodgers or something like that, where I'll go out certainly and read that. Some of my favorite articles are when, like a Bill Huber or a Tom Silverstein or, one of those type of people will will get a GM from another team or somebody in the front office from another team or an anonymous scout or things like that gives their take on the state of the Packers. That stuff is always interesting to me. But as far as analysis pieces or things like that, I stay away entirely from any articles because I want everything to be my own. So I will say, though, I did see the tweet from Dyer Carragher and wanted to play off of it a little bit because I think it's a really interesting topic. So enough about that. Let's jump in. So as far as I can tell, Brian Gutekunst has signed 19 free agents. And if I missed anyone, definitely let me know. I'm going to rank them from 19 to the best. And we'll get to why I'm not saying number one in just a moment. But from 19 to the best. And I'm going to go through each one and why my reasoning is the way that it is. I am not including Rasul Douglas in this group because he was a signing off of a practice squad. Same thing with a Bo Melton. So anything like that and some of those type of moves I did not include in there. So there was 19 that I found. Again, if I missed any, please let me know in the comments below. But number 19, Brian Gutekunst's worst free agent signing, in my opinion, Jimmy Graham. A 3-year, $30 million deal immediately after releasing Jordy Nelson to save money. And this was his real first foray into free agency, making a huge free agent splash. And Jimmy Graham just did not turn out in any capacity. Making things worse is as soon as they finally moved on from Jimmy Graham, which they also kept him a year too long, unquestionably. I was a huge proponent of releasing him a year earlier. They didn't. They kept him around another year, increased his salary cap hit, and it was a massive mistake. And then the worst of the worst is that somehow, some way, for whatever reason, Jimmy Graham then signs with the Bears and has a better year with the Bears than he did in any of his seasons with the Packers. And it was frustrating. He lost kind of all of his superpowers coming to Green Bay. He was already a terrible blocker, and he was a worse blocker in Green Bay. He lost his red zone ability. He was no longer a jump ball threat. Did not turn out at all until he went back to Chicago and somehow regained that a little bit. He could not win in the middle of the field. He did not have any run after the catch any ability. He was just toast. He was just not good anymore. And it was a massively disappointing free agent stint for Jimmy Graham in Green Bay. And again, 3 years, $30 million, by far and away, and like I said, in my opinion, the Brian Gutekunst's worst free agent signing so far. Number 18, Byron Bell. This was more of a, this was not a high-priced free agent signing. They brought him in 2018, his first year as general manager, and he made a handful of starts. The issue was he was just really, 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 really bad. And that's like, you can say like, oh, they didn't spend that much money on him. That's great. But like, if you spend any money on a player and they're just really, really bad, that still is really, really bad, right? So, I get that, bringing in a veteran depth piece like Byron Bell made sense at the time, but he ultimately would end up getting in games, starting a bunch of games, and just being terrible. So this was a L in the column for Brian Gutekunst in free agent signings. Number 18 on my list is Byron Bell. Number 17, Devin Funchess. They bring him in 2020. He sits out the entire season in the COVID year, comes back in 2021, has some controversial comments and statements and doesn't do anything and ends up being released. And that was basically it with Devin Funchess. No ROI ever for the signing of Devin Funchess. So just never turned out from day one, has not done anything in the league since then. He tried converting to tight end, just hasn't worked out. So Devin Funchess ends up number 17 on this list. Number 16, Muhammad Wilkerson, a decent free agent signing from the New York Jets. You could tell his career was winding down, didn't have the same juice as he had earlier in his career when he was a phenomenal football player. Brian Gutekunst took a flyer on him, a 1-year, $5 million deal. He got injured in week 3, never played again. Next offseason, he became a free agent. He got suspended in the offseason. Like I said, he never played football again. So that ended up being basically a total wash. They got him for a couple weeks. He had a major injury. It was a fluke injury. It wasn't really any fault of Muhammad Wilkerson's, but even before that, he just didn't look like he was the same player he was earlier in his career. And it just ended up being basically a lost $5 million into Muhammad Wilkerson with no return on investment whatsoever. Number 15, Sammy Watkins. They go out, they try to do something to replace Davante Adams. It wasn't like they knew this wasn't an apples to apples thing, not even close. It was basically a small flyer deal and a veteran free agent that had some success in the league and basically at least provided something to almost every team that he was on for a little bit. But the same injury issues for Sammy Watkins flared up. He never gained any consistency in the offense. There were times where you saw him completely running the incorrect route. It just did not work out, and he didn't even make it through the first season. He ends up being released. Baltimore claims him, and the rest was history. So Sammy Watkins, number 15 on the list. Number 14, your favorite fullback, Danny Vitale. He had a cup of coffee. They played him at fullback a little bit. He had a couple nice games, couple nice blocks, never really did anything, but they didn't invest much into him. Got a few games at fullback out of him, and the rest was history. Number 13 was Dallin Levitt. Name your favorite Dallin Levitt play. I will wait. I don't know that I can point to anything that Dallin Levitt actually did last year, but he was a core special teams player, and I do think he helped reset that culture in the special teams locker room. Rich Bisaccia speaks extremely high of him, and I just think him coming over from the Raiders with Bisaccia allowed the Packers to have sort of a veteran-ish special teams presence to set the tone for what this was going to be like in Green Bay, and I do think that had legitimate value. Levitt's a free agent again this year. I would expect Green Bay to try to bring him back on a vet minimum deal for that same reason. Look at him almost as the fourth special teams guy. I don't think Green Bay has any plans of playing him actually on the field on defense at safety. He is a special teams guy through and through. He's basically kicker, punter, long snapper, and then Dallin Levitt. Those are your four special teams guys that are going to be on your roster. But he provided that, and for that reason, he's coming in at number 13 on my list. Number 12 was Christian Kirksey. Had an up and down time in Green Bay. A couple games where it looked like, oh, Green Bay really found something here, but ultimately did not have the same athleticism as he did earlier in his career. Never made a big impact, had some injury issues, ends up going to Houston, and sort of the rest was history there as well. So I wouldn't say like a bad free agent signing. This was always a value free agent signing and just somebody that was going to sort of be a stopgap at inside linebacker. I think they kind of got that. I think they mostly got their money's worth, but he just ended up not really being a long-term answer for Green Bay. They moved on and went in a different direction, and it just was what it was. But number 12 on my list, Christian Kirksey. Number 11 brings me to Pat O'Donnell. He had a fine year as a punter. We'll see if he can win the job again this year and stick around for his second season. Seems like the punter position in Green Bay is basically like the defense against the dark arts professor in Harry Potter. Like it just never seems to work out. But, Pat O'Donnell had a fine season. It was nothing to write home about. It was still a below average season, but let's be real. You've got half of your games at Lambeau. You've got another one at least in Chicago. You're going to play a lot of games in not great weather as a punter for the Green Bay Packers. So, I think it's fine. It was a fine free agent signing, and he was also one of their best holders in a while for field goals and got that consistency back with Mason Crosby. So I think there was value there, but he ends up again coming in at number 11 on this list. All right, that brings us to our top 10. Number 10 was Rick Wagner. Rick Wagner was a really nice free agent find, and he only played for the one season, but he provided depth at left tackle, he provided depth at right tackle, ended up starting a bunch of games that season, started in the playoff game. Probably his worst game of the season, unfortunately, was that playoff game where he struggled. But outside of that, he had a very, very nice season leading up to that. And for the low amount that Green Bay paid him, they got a ton of ROI for what he provided that season. So he ends up number 10 on the list. You could even bump him up a couple of spots, and I certainly wouldn't argue with you. Number 9 was Jarran Reed. And Jarran Reed had a very interesting year last year. There was a lot of nondescript from Jarran Reed, just meaning like you didn't really notice him for huge chunks of time, meaning he didn't really get blown off the ball and didn't do anything bad, but he didn't really make any plays either. It wasn't like some of the struggles of, defensive lines past where guys were getting blown off the ball and there were gaping holes in the middle of the defensive line. No, he held up pretty well, but for the most part, again, didn't do much on the positive side to really make up or like just become a playmaker, right? And then he had the game against Miami where he forces the fumble and maybe the biggest play of the year at that point when it looked like Miami was going to maybe run away with that game and end Green Bay season. He gets that forced fumble recovery and really changes the trajectory of that game and potentially the Packers season as well. So I thought he had a pretty nice season overall, especially for the low price free agent deal that they got him at. I thought that was a pretty savvy signing, and he comes in at number 9. Number 8 is Rudy Ford. They pick him up right at the end of training camp last year. He gets released by the Jaguars. They pick him up. And he was just expected to sort of be a special teams guy, right? But he ends up being a special teams guy. And then he ends up starting a decent amount of games at safety, or at least playing a significant role. I don't know actually how many games he legit started at safety, but he was in their nickel for a huge ton, which is basically a starting safety at that point. And he had some massive turnovers. He played well on special teams, and he was just one of the guys on that defense that actually consistently rallied to the football, tackled pretty well. He had some mistakes too. It was far from perfect football, but super low price free agent signing. They get a lot of special teams value out of him, and they got a pretty decent defender too. That was a low-key savvy free agent signing by Brian Gutekunst. Number 7, 2018 Tramon Williams. Remember, he had left Green Bay, and he went to a couple of times. I think I want to say Cleveland, and then he was in Arizona, I believe, right before. They pick him back up in 2018. He spends a couple more years in Green Bay. I'm not talking about in 2020 when they picked him back up at the end and probably should have started him instead of Kevin King. We're not going to talk about that today. But in 2018, 2019, he came back, and I think they sent him to like a 2-year, $10 million deal, something like that. And he ended up playing safety that year and did a pretty decent job at safety. He played some corner and just really sort of solidified a secondary that needed that veteran presence. And I thought Tramon came back and played some pretty darn good football considering where he was at in his career, and really found his niche back in Green Bay. And like I said, he had to play different positions. It didn't slow him down. Nothing like not prime Tramon Williams by any means, but they got their money's worth in that free agent signing. And even though he had to play out a position, he did everything he could to try to be as successful as possible and make that defense work. Ultimately, it didn't, and that was the team that struggled and eventually in 2018 got Mike McCarthy fired, but it wasn't due to Tramon Williams, and I actually like that signing by Brian Gutekunst. Number 6 is Billy Turner. I was skeptical of the Billy Turner signing to begin with, but he came in, he played multiple positions along the offensive line. And I talk about this all the time. Like, I think overall, like if you were to like say like let's just use Madden numbers, right? Like a 75 would be like a decent like offensive lineman. I think Billy Turner is probably somewhere around like the 70, 71, 70, like 70, 71, maybe right around there in like Madden terms. But what I fail to, even I fail to recognize sometimes is that there's just not very many even average to, slightly below average offensive linemen in this league. There's a lot of very, very bad offensive linemen. And if you can get a guy who you don't have to change your game plan around, and yeah, is going to allow a pressure here and there and is going to miss a run block here and there, but for the vast majority of the game is going to be fine, there is so much value in that. And there's even so much more value if you can play basically 5 positions along the offensive line and do a pretty good job at it. So Billy had a lot of value. I thought he played some of his best seasons early in his Green Bay career. And, he's still kicking around in the league too. I know he was with Denver last year, had some injury issues, but overall that ended up being a pretty solid signing by Brian Gutekunst. All right, that brings me to number 5. And number 5 on my list is Keyshawn Nixon. Talk about a value free agent signing. Bare minimum deal, the least they could possibly pay him based on his tenure in the league. 0 signing bonus. They get him as a flyer, and he ends up not only being a dynamic returner, both kick returner and punt returner, a first team All-Pro returner, but also played very well in the slot in the nickel defense when they called upon him in that situation as well. He was an aggressive tackler. He also played a lot of special teams, not including kick return and punt return, and he was a All-Pro as a returner. So bare minimum deal. They find him on the market, and I'm sure hat tip to Rich Bisaccia on that one as well. But man, what a massive signing that was, and really was one of the few bright spots for Green Bay a season ago. So he comes in at number 5. And that leaves me with 4 players left. Friends, how many times have I come on here and told you, I just don't know? I have no idea. I'm telling you right now, I have no idea how to rank these final 4 Packers. I have no idea where to begin. I tried putting them in all different orders, and none of it seemed to make sense. So today, I am leaving this one up to you. I'm going to let you order the final 4 on this list. And the final 4 names are Preston Smith, Za'Darius Smith, DeVondre Campbell, and Adrian Amos. Those are the final 4. And those are the best 4, in my opinion, in some order, in some capacity. So the interesting one is Preston Smith, who I think if you took Za'Darius Smith's best season, DeVondre Campbell's best season, Adrian Amos's best season, and Preston Smith's best season, I think Preston Smith has the worst best season of any of those 4. I think he had a couple off seasons within that, especially 2020. Like 2020, he was not very good in that year. And last year, he was just okay. So like he's mostly been consistent and he's been solid, but he's been consistent and solid for 4 years. And he's now back for a 5th season, which we know you can't say about Za'Darius Smith, which I don't think you're going to be able to say about Adrian Amos. And Campbell will only be in his 3rd year coming up this year. So it was a very good signing. And again, he remains on the team and he's been a consistent player. Like I said, a consummate professional, a real leader on the defense for Green Bay. So if you want to put him anywhere 1, 2, 3, or 4, I totally get it. I think his peak play was worse than the peak Za'Darius, peak DeVondre, peak Adrian Amos. But like I said, you could easily make an argument for him anywhere 1 through 4. Za'Darius Smith at number 3, or number 3 of the guys we're discussing here, but you can put him anywhere on your list. In his first 2 years in Green Bay, he had 164 quarterback pressures. 164. In his first year, 2019, he had 105. 105. Preston Smith, for example, in his 4 seasons in Green Bay, has 196 pressures in 4 seasons. Z had 164 in his first 2. I would put 2019 Za'Darius Smith on the level with any Packers defender in any season that I've ever watched. I would put 2019 Za'Darius against your best Reggie White season. I would put him against your best Charles Woodson season, your best Clay Matthews season, your best Nick Collins season, your best, any season, your best Leroy Butler season. I would put 2019 Za'Darius Smith up against any of them. And I'm not sold that his season doesn't win. It was that good. He was dominant. He was unbelievable. Then he comes back in 2020 and has a really good season. Nowhere near what he did in 2019. Struggled as a run defender. I would argue that he got a little bit selfish, that he went big game hunting on his own, not really holding up his end of the bargain with what he was supposed to do in every single game and kind of be a team defender, but would come up with basically 2 big plays almost every single game. So it was still really good, just not what he was in 2019. And then 2021, he plays a handful of snaps in week 1, misses the entire rest of the season up until he plays 15 snaps in the playoff game. Unfortunately, they lose both of those games, by the way, in 2021 that he actually plays in. And he played 30 snaps total, and then he became a Minnesota Viking the following season in 2022. So you had this unbelievable Hall of Fame-esque season in 2019. Looked like quite arguably the best defender in the NFL that year was Za'Darius Smith in 2019. And then 2020 was good, to even maybe, I would say good to really good. And then 2021, he didn't exist because of injury, basically. And you had some off-field sort of drama, too. And then he's gone in 2022. So I don't know where you rank that. DeVondre Campbell, 2 seasons in Green Bay. The first one, they get him on a peanuts deal, and he's a first-team All-Pro defender. Then they come back and give him a big deal, and he was fine to slightly below average and nowhere near what he was in 2021. So that's another hard one to discuss because you had 1 year where they paid him nothing, basically nothing, and he was a first-team All-Pro defender. And then you give him a bigger deal, and he came back and was not as bad as I think people thought he was, but like just nowhere near what he was in 2021. So that's another interesting one. And this one, DeVondre probably is like, what happens this year? If he's really good again and he's anywhere near the All-Pro level, like he jumps to number 1 on the list in all likelihood. If he kind of has the same year he had last year, I don't know, maybe he's probably down at number 4 on the list. So, but either way, that first year, you get a first-team All-Pro defender on a peanuts deal. That is a massive signing. And a year where they were trying to compete at the highest of levels, they needed DeVondre Campbell, and that was a massive hit. And then Adrian Amos, like you had 3 years of the most consistent safety play you will ever see. He was really good in every game, never made mistakes, was always where he was supposed to be. And then he had a pretty darn bad 2022 in his 4th season. Probably isn't back in 2023. So that's another tough one where you got 3 years of like really good consistent safety play, but never like Pro Bowl caliber play and never like huge playmaking type play, but just really sound, consistent defender that you would sign up for any given day of the week. And then a pretty bad season. So you could weigh out all of those in any order that you want, but Preston, Za'Darius, DeVondre, and Adrian Amos, in my opinion, end up in some order in the top 4. I will let you guys argue that out because I've tried putting them in every order and I don't know. My gut tells me, I don't know. I literally do not know. I don't know how I would order those because they're so different and unique in how they've had impact on Green Bay. My gut tells me like Za'Darius was the best signing just because how impactful he was in 2019. It was just an unbelievable season and still had a massive impact in 2020. And then maybe DeVondre, then maybe Adrian, then maybe Preston. But I don't know. Like Preston at number 4 seems the easiest one to me of the group, but you could make an argument anyway, and I wouldn't fight you against it. So I will let you guys decide. That's going to do it for me today. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll be right back here tomorrow where I'll have a much stronger take, I promise. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.